Good evening, good morning, good day to everyone. Today, we are bringing you a security flash to talk about the Ivanti vulnerabilities and all of the stuff that's happening around the two products that have been discovered to be pretty badly vulnerable, some of the exploitation that's been happening around that as well. So I have Erica joining me. Erica, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey guys, I'm Erica Azad, and I am in content marketing here at Bugcrowd.
Excellent. So actually, let's kick it off like this. What is Ivanti, Erica? What?
Yes. So Avanti, formerly known as Landesk by a lot of the IT community, is an IT service management company. They also do unified endpoint management and endpoint security. They're a software company based out of Salt Lake City, Utah.
Right, got it, got it. And the Connect Secure and the Policy Secure products that are kind of the focus of all of this. Can you talk a little bit more about what they are?
Yeah, so most people probably would recognize them on their computer as a VPN. That's what they're widely used for, especially in a post-COVID world.
Mm, got it, got it. All right, so yeah, talking about what happened, basically, it's been this very, kind of dramatic progression of events that have happened since the beginning of December when this all kicked off, which culminated today with CISA issuing a notice to US federal government agencies that if you've got either of these two products within your environment, you've got until I think it's 9 p.m. on February 3rd to turn it off and basically rip it out. That's not a thing they do all that often, and we'll go into a little bit of the backstory of how we got there. But yeah, as I mentioned, the story pretty much first kicked off back on the 3rd of December when Velexity, who are another cybersecurity company, noticed basically suspicious behavior that they tied back to these two products. In the process of doing threat hunting and a bunch of research around that, they discovered two fairly critical and fairly easy to exploit vulnerabilities within these two products, and they found a whole bunch of evidence of attacker behavior. So they discovered it was found through basically incident response and discovery of actual malicious exploitation, as opposed to kind of the more proactive way of doing it, which is to look at the machine initially and try to find vulnerabilities and fix them before that sort of thing happens. So that started off a bunch of conversation around the overall kind of security of the systems themselves. The first two CVEs got released on the 10th of January, just checking my notes here. And there was a lot of conversation at that point around, what should be done to mitigate. At that point, I think it was Unit 421 came out and said that they were able to observe about 30,000 instances of this software across the internet. So that's a pretty juicy attack surface if you're a bad guy who wanted to make use of that. And Ivanti came out and basically put out a fixed timeline for people to be able to expect patches and all those sorts of things. Last week they had to push that timeline, presumably because the complexity of the fix itself was a little bit greater than they thought it would be. Oftentimes with hardware in particular, like that can happen because you've got dependencies and all sorts of things that need to be basically regression tested to make sure your fix doesn't break other stuff. And then on February 1st, today, two new vulnerabilities dropped as CVEs as well. So yeah, basically that's kind of the timeline of all of this. I think the criticality of the issues themselves, they're all high impact, high severity issues. They're all very reliable, fairly easy to exploit. So as a bad guy, you can do a lot with them. I think as well on top of that, going back to your kind of description of what these products are, Erica, they tend to have they're in a good spot for a bad guy to make use of them. They tend to be kind of in the center of everything. And if you get onto that, then you can go a lot of different places. So as a bad guy, there's a lot of optionality to breaching a box like this.
So let's dive a little bit more into the criticality of these. I'm curious what type of impact organizations would expect to see from potential exploits of these vulnerabilities.
Yeah, the challenging part at this point is that there's so much attention on these products. You've got white hat researchers going and doing additional vuln research, which is a part of where these two new CVEs came from. You've presumably got a broader array of bad guys doing the same thing. And keep in mind, this was discovered basically off the back of people trying to do bad stuff and doing research, finding the vulnerabilities and exploiting them. So from an impact standpoint, really it kind of comes down to it's anyone's game at this point, which is I think why CISA basically came out and said, no, just turn it off. We're out of time to try to patch these things. While we're trying to get that part resolved, the safest option at this point in time is to just unplug it.
Okay, so let's dive into that piece a little bit more because I think that's it's quite a big deal. That's something we don't see every day.
Another thing is under
So
sure.
you mentioned this earlier, but basically the US government released an emergency directive to they basically had 48-hour deadline to rip the VPN out of their systems essentially. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on first off, like how frequently something like that happens. Like, is this something you're seeing regularly? Is it kind of once in a blue moon? And then, yeah, I would love to just hear your thoughts on that.
It's pretty like it's pretty rare. I'm struggling. I'm sure this has happened before, but in the kind of the pre-work for this call, I was struggling to think of another example of that in recent history. It does hark back a little to some of the the ransomware Armageddon stuff that we saw happen during 2020 with the onset of COVID, because all these organizations switching really rapidly from an on-prem kind of work style to having to support work from home. What that netted out to was the deployment of a whole bunch of different, remote access solutions, usually in quite a hurry. And of course, as an attacker, it's like, oh, that's a juicy, reliable target. I'm going to start doing a whole bunch of vulnerability research on the most common systems and figure out what kind of capability I can develop to go off and exploit this shift in the market trend. So like Pulse Secure, which is, I believe, another Ivanti product, came into scope for that. I think it was, third quarter of 2020. There was a bunch of others as well. So yeah, I mean, the idea of a directive being issued to say like rip this stuff out and just turn it off because we are literally out of time from an exploitation standpoint and a risk standpoint to try to do it the normal way. That's not a thing that happens very often. And I think as well, it's got quite a lot of impact. If this is being used for remote access and the instruction is turn it off, then that begs the question, yeah, but how are people going to do remote access? Because you've still got to keep your organization running. So it's a pretty dramatic move, I think, in that sense. And those combinations of kind of factors isn't really something that I've seen before.
I'm curious for government agencies, they have very clear mandates on what they do next.
Hmm.
How would you look at this as for industries that are not government? Like, would you be looking at mandates like this and having a similar response if you were in financial services or tech, or like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think the first thing there, you know, CISA issued this directive, like they know it's a dramatic move. Do you know what I mean? So that begs the question, why do they think it's critical enough to issue this kind of advice? And even if you're not like subject to the mandate itself, because you're not government, it is probably still pretty good advice
Yeah.
at this time. At the same time as it's incredibly inconvenient. Like you've got to figure out, I think there's going to be a lot of pretty fast and furious work to figure out an alternative access solution over the next 48 hours, definitely within the US government, but probably most other organizations are going to be thinking about a similar thing. Really kind of what it looks like to me is that Avanti are having a lot of trouble getting this thing fixed. And in the meantime, there's more research discovering more issues of a similar kind of critical nature, and it sort of just compounds on top of itself, right? Like the reason for pushing some of the subsequent patches is that they had to get the first pieces done first, which to me implies that they're working pretty hard on kind of the fundamentals of this piece of hardware. And if that's not complete, then they can't fix anything else on top of that. And I think that's that kind of, game of chicken that we're basically playing with this stuff right now is one of the reasons where it's like, yeah, we're out of time. We just need to turn it off. So as a non-government organization that relies on this stuff, I would be thinking very seriously about, implementing a backup access plan sooner rather than later, and getting yourself into a position where you can switch it off until it's fixed and then figure out what you want to do from there. Outside of that, it's, it's probably safe to assume that if you've got this stuff in your environment and exposed to the internet, probably been compromised at this point, maybe not by the same actor that Velexity picked up back in December. But, given there's been so much attention and so many people now know how to exploit this stuff, it's kind of a free for all on the internet at this point in time. So switching gears into threat hunting, which is actually another part of the CISA directive, it's like turn it off and then go do proactive threat hunting on anything it was connected to, because it's pretty likely you've got company in your network. I think that second part in particular is good advice for non-government orgs.
Okay. I think in these security flashes, we definitely try to give background, but then also some actionable what now. So I guess maybe let's start with how can organizations identify if they have been exploited? You just said that maybe assume the worst, but what advice would you give to organizations?
Yeah, I think probably the first bit would be to make sure you've like conclusively like you're either going to know you've got this stuff and you're already thinking about this problem, or you're not going to be sure. And I think it's a wise thing for organizations to basically just ask the question a second time. Make sure that like, oh, is there, shadow IT where this sort of thing exists within the organization that's not necessarily in the scope of traditional patching or whatever else. This is the whole attack surface management as a as an area is really kind of a product of the fact that's actually a really hard question to answer sometimes. You end up with large organizations with different teams and growth through acquisition and all that kind of stuff. You can end up with gear that you just didn't realize was there. And when something like this goes down, it creates a fire drill. So, where we can help with that and where security researchers can help with that is to structure programs where they're actually going off and looking just for this and trying to work out how exploitable it might be from the outside in. That's one approach to it. I think in terms of indicators of compromise, it's really going to come down to, what you've got set up from like a logging standpoint. There's definitely IOCs, like indicators of compromise sitting out on the internet based on attacker behavior that's been seen historically. But as I just mentioned, like there's a lot of people that are potentially exploiting this stuff now. So they're not all going to do the same things. So, really what that comes down to is if you've got logs, like get into them and try to figure out if anything bad's gone down. And yeah, aside from that, again, the role that the crowd can play is in identifying this stuff. And I do think, stepping back a second, the idea of using, crowdsourced security testing and kind of research-driven assurance to make sure that products don't end up in this position in the first place. A lot of the companies that we work with actually do engage the crowd through the Bugcrowd platform to do just that. It's like we've got this hardware that's sitting in the middle of everything, and it's really important for it to be secure. Let's test whether it is or not, and then learn how we can make it more resilient and build confidence on the market side at the same time. So those are a few ideas. The last one obviously requires winding back the clock a little bit on this one, which we can't do. But just as a couple of general hip shot answers to that question.
Okay. So to wrap up, once organizations have identified potential exploits in their environment, I mean, from your perspective, if you're a CISO right now, after that, what are you doing next? What are your next steps to minimize exposure?
Yeah, the big thing there would be to talk to your IT team and talk to whoever's responsible for like the direct management of that asset, because obviously they're going to play a pretty critical role in everything that happens next. But then understanding how important is this stuff to your business, like what is the cost of just switching it off or doing something like that. I think the answer to that question for most CISOs is going to pop up pretty quickly. And at that point, it just becomes a return on investment conversation when it comes to actually getting buy-in to make that call and get it done. Like if the cost is low, just couch it in that way and say, here's the risk of leaving it on. Let's balance those things out and make a decision. If the cost is higher, then switching gears into trying to figure out how to create a fallback option that you can replace this stuff with, at least in the short term. I think those are probably the things I'd be doing next.
You've touched on this multiple times, but I think it's important to kind of call out as we wrap up because this is a solution that is used for VPNs in a remote world. There's a pretty massive potential impact to productivity, right? If people aren't able to access VPNs, in theory, they might not be able to access their work, right?
Yep, 100%, 100%. And that's where that last recommendation I just gave comes back into it, because ultimately you don't want to be in Ivanti's position as a vendor of those types of products to begin with. I think this whole idea of like nation state threat actors targeting remote access systems to get their thing done because of how much access they have to, inside the organization, how trusted they tend to be, and then the fact that like they're public by default, so actually getting to them is fairly straightforward. That's not going to slow down. Like the bad guys have figured out that this is a pretty great place to do security research. So as folks that invent this type of solution, give us a call. We can definitely help with that. Or, in any case, like get focused on research driven assurance on your stuff to make sure it's resilient, because this will happen again and you probably don't want it to be you. So yeah, that would be, that piece. Yeah, just, literally putting myself in the shoes of an attacker, like it makes total sense. Did they go after this stuff? It's a really logical and juicy target. And attackers are economically rational. They're trying to figure out, the best return on investment for whatever their goals are. This is a pretty good way to get that return. So yeah.
Well, great. I think you've provided some great insight. Anything else before we wrap up today?
Yeah, look, I would just say, when it comes to discovery on this stuff, so probably one of the first times that Bugcrowd deployed the crowd specifically for the purpose of discovery of a vulnerable thing was actually Log4j, because everyone had this same issue. You've got a library that's everywhere, very easy to exploit, very difficult to fully understand where all it might be. So we turned the crowd loose on just finding instances of vulnerable Log4j. We actually did a lot of that work in conjunction with CISA into the federal civilian agencies back when that all went down. And we can do that type of thing again, especially on the government side. So that's definitely something that we can help out with, very specifically here. And yeah, probably the other side of it is that if you don't have a threat hunting capability within your organization, like going back to that question that you asked before, not everyone has the ability to do that. And it's, I think, a pretty good time and a good reminder that sort of skill set within your security team is pretty important to have for stuff like this, because otherwise you're having to reach out to a third party, pay emergency rates, do all those different things. Just thinking about how you implement a threat hunting program within your organization for when this type of thing happens, I think that's a pretty important thing for folks to start thinking about as well.
Great.
Yeah,
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time tonight, Casey.
absolutely. Likewise.